as we begin our journey into the 19th century. Picture yourself in the young Republic of the United States on the appropriately named Mayflower. You are adrift in a vast ocean with only the hope of finding new land to call home. You've got your trusty musket in one hand, a Bible in the other, and you're ready to tame this wild frontier. But wait, is that all there is? Are you sure about this? Because if you look around, you might not like what you see. Welcome to episode 1 of Crash Course Geography, which is all about understanding where things are, why they're there, and how they got there. In each episode, we explore a different place or region and use geographic tools and concepts to help us understand it better. And by the end of each episode, you'll have a mental model that explains how all the pieces fit together. This first episode is an introduction to geography in the early 1800s. So let's go back to our story. The year is 1800 and you're looking out over a rather small country. Despite winning its independence from the British Empire in 1776, the United States was still a rather modest-sized nation, especially when compared to some of the big European countries that dominated the world at the time. At this point, the U.S. controlled just under half of the landmass of the current contiguous United States. Back then, the country's borders were fairly well defined in the east. The Appalachian Mountains formed a mostly natural barrier along the eastern coast and to the north. The border with Canada was pretty much set based on colonial boundaries during the time of the American Revolution. To the west, though the situation was more complicated. During the Revolutionary War, the Americans fought against the British largely east of the Appalachian Mountains, focusing their efforts around the coastal regions and the interior river valleys. These areas were easier to traverse and had higher concentrations of people and resources. As far as the western lands were concerned, both the British and the Americans knew that those territories were difficult to reach and even harder to settle. Even after declaring independence, the exact boundaries of the United States were a bit of a mystery. West of the Appalachians was an almost entirely unknown and unsettled region, often referred to simply as the West. The only thing that was really known about the West at the time was that it existed, but exactly what was out there remained a mystery. There were rumors of vast plains, maybe even an inland sea, and maybe some Native American tribes that could put up a fight, but no one was exactly sure, because no one had been there yet. And this lack of knowledge left the question of who owned these western lands unanswered. Some people called for the United States to annex the area immediately, arguing that it rightfully belonged to them simply because it was so close by. Others weren't so sure, pointing out that the government didn't even know what kind of terrain the region had, or whether it would be worth the trouble to settle. Ultimately, the decision was made to explore the area and figure it out later. And so began the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804. Imagine you're one of the members of the Corps of Discovery, an elite team tasked with exploring the Louisiana Purchase, a massive region of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. What's that? Oh, right. Before setting out on your journey, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned you to document everything you see. He wants to know what kind of terrain you encounter, if it's suitable for farming, and most importantly, who else is living there. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to discover what lies beyond the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, to find a route to the Pacific, and perhaps most significantly, to see what the United States will become. Your journey begins in St. Louis, Missouri, a town on the edge of the frontier. The Mississippi River, which had been charted long before, served as the main artery for trade and travel. Here, rivers from all across the interior of the continent flowed into the great Mississippi, carrying goods and people along with them. But the expedition is coming at the tail end of winter, and you know that soon the river will flood, making navigation impossible. Therefore, you decide to follow the river northward, hoping to find a route over or around the Rocky Mountains. As you head north, you and the rest of the Corps of Discovery pass through the lands of several Native American nations, including the Mandan and the Hidatsa. As you make contact with these groups, you learn about the land and its inhabitants from them. They tell you about the buffalo that roam the plains, the fertile land along the river valleys, and the challenges of life on the frontier. You also learn about the various Native American nations that live in this part of the continent, each with their own language, culture, and way of life. Some of them have lived here for generations, while others are relatively new to the area. You hear stories about the Lakota people to the north, the Cheyenne to the west, and many others. Each has their own territory and way of life, but they all face the same challenges. As you continue your journey, you realize that this region is unlike anything you've seen before. The landscape is vast and varied, from the rolling plains to the towering mountains. It's clear that this region is full of natural resources, including fertile land for farming, abundant wildlife for hunting, and vast forests for timber. But it's also clear that it's a challenging environment to live in. The winters are long and harsh, and the summers can be hot and humid. You learn that the Native American nations that live in this region have developed unique ways of life to cope with the challenges of the environment. They rely on the buffalo for food, clothing, and shelter, and they have developed sophisticated irrigation systems to farm the land. They also have deep knowledge of the plants and animals in the region and use them for their medicinal properties. Finally, you reach the Pacific Ocean, completing your journey across the continent. But it's not the Pacific that makes this trip truly significant. It's what you've learned about the region along the way. You've discovered that the Louisiana Purchase is a vast and varied territory with tremendous potential for the United States. The fertile land, abundant wildlife, and strategic location make it a valuable asset for the young nation. The Native American nations you've encountered are resilient and resourceful and offer valuable knowledge about the region. The discovery of this region has opened up new possibilities for the United States, and you're a part of something bigger than yourself. And that's the end of our story. But let's take a moment to think about the themes that ran through it. The story of the cause of discovery is a story of exploration and discovery, but it's also a story about change. As the United States expanded westward, it brought new challenges and opportunities for the people who lived in the newly acquired territories. For the Native American nations, this expansion meant the loss of their traditional lands and ways of life. For the settlers, it meant the chance to start new lives in a new territory. The story also highlights the importance of understanding the environment and the people who live in it. The cause of discovery had to learn to rely on the knowledge and skills of the Native American nations they encountered in order to survive in the unfamiliar terrain. This theme of environmental awareness is a key part of geography. One of the most important aspects of geography is understanding how physical processes shape the natural environment and human activities. Geographers study everything from the smallest atom to the largest star in the universe, and they examine how these processes interact with each other and affect the world around us. We'll spend a lot of time in this course talking about the physical geography of a place, which includes its climate, geology, and vegetation. All of these things play a role in shaping the environment and the way humans interact with it. Human geography is equally important. Human geographers study how people interact with the physical environment and how they adapt to and modify it. This includes things like population, distribution, economic activity, and cultural patterns. By understanding human geography, we can better understand the social and economic forces that shape our world. In fact, human geography is such an important part of our lives that it has been suggested that everyone has one. That's right. We all have our own personal geographies based on our experiences and perspectives. Our personal geographies are shaped by our relationships, our memories, and our interactions with other people. It's our unique lens through which we view the world. So, let's review. Physical geography is the study of the environment, and human geography is the study of how humans interact with that environment. Together, they form a complete picture of the world around us. When we study geography, we try to understand the connections between places and the patterns that exist across space. We ask questions like, why do certain things happen in certain places? And how did they get there? Why does one place look the way it does while another looks different? And how did they come to look that way? Geography helps us answer these questions by teaching us about the processes that shape our world. In short, geography is about understanding where things are, why they're there, and how they got there. And now that you've got a basic understanding of the geography of the early 1800s, you're ready to take a deeper dive into the history and culture of the United States in this next episode. Thanks for watching this episode of Crash Course Geography, which was filmed at a studio and made in partnership with a digital studio in nature. You want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever? You can join our community on a crowdfunding platform. All right, we're ready to get into Chapter 2. If you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's do it. Okay, chapter titles. This chapter is titled The Importance of the Mississippi River. So that gives us a hint. And the big idea here is that the Mississippi River was vitally important to the United States, and particularly to the city of New Orleans. But why? Well, you can figure this out Just look at a map. Look at where the Mississippi River empties into the ocean. What is the nearest major city? New Orleans. What is so great about that location? Well, if you live west of the Mississippi River, there is only one way to get your goods to the ocean in order to export them to Europe or Asia. You must use the Mississippi River. If you live east of the Mississippi River, well, you have several options to get your goods to the ocean. You could use the Atlantic coast. You could use various other rivers and tributaries that empty into the Atlantic Ocean. You could go all the way up to the Great Lakes, and then go down the St. Lawrence River and out to the Atlantic. Lots of options, but only one option if you are west of the Mississippi that would make the port of New Orleans very important. And it did. It was the busiest port in the U.S. from 1831 until 1923. So why was the Mississippi River so important to the United States? Well, back in Chapter 1, what did we learn? We learned that there were two regions of the United States that had very different economies. The East had an economy based on manufacturing, shipping, and fishing. The West had an economy based on farming, and the farmers of the West were producing a lot of stuff. They were producing grain, they were producing cotton. Cotton gin made cotton very profitable. And also, since the invention of the steamboat, farmers could sell their products farther away because steamboats could travel up the Mississippi River. This meant that the market for Western farmers expanded dramatically, but now they needed a way to export their goods overseas. Remember, these farmers were not shipping their goods to some factory in Philadelphia or Boston where they would be manufactured into something more valuable. No. These farmers were shipping raw materials, and so they needed to get those raw materials from their fields to the ocean in order to ship them to Europe or Asia. Steamboats could get them most of the way there, but only to New Orleans. From there, they had to find some other means of transportation to get their goods on a ship in the ocean. But the Mississippi River provided that last little push to the ocean. It allowed the farmers of the West to make a profit. But wait. Second. Does this mean that the people east of the Mississippi weren't interested in the Mississippi River? Of course not. In fact, the Eastern industrialists wanted control of the Mississippi River, because that gave them access to cheap Western resources like timber, and especially like the cotton that Western farmers produced. That cotton was essential to the factories of the Eastern United States. Okay, so we know the basic reason why the Mississippi River was so important. But let us look at two specific ways in which the river facilitated the growth of the United States. First, let's talk about farmers. As I mentioned a moment ago, the invention of the cotton gin made cotton very profitable, and that attracted many farmers to the Mississippi Valley. In fact, by 1860, Mississippi was the leading producer of cotton in the entire country, and that meant that the port of New Orleans was sending a lot of cotton to European and Asian markets. And all that cotton brought wealth to the farmers of the Mississippi Valley. But it wasn't just cotton. Remember, there were steamboats traveling up and down the Mississippi River, and that meant that Western farmers could sell their goods in places that they never could have imagined before the steamboat. Produce from Illinois could end up in New Orleans. Produce from Alabama could end up in St. Louis. The market expanded dramatically for Western farmers. Not only could they sell their goods to people nearby, but they could send their goods hundreds and hundreds of miles away to people they had never met. But obviously, for this to work, the farmers had to have something to sell. And they did. They sold agricultural products. They sold food. And that meant that Eastern factory owners could purchase food for their workers. And they could purchase the materials that they used in their factories, like timber. All of that flowed down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and out to the world. Second way in which the Mississippi River facilitated the growth of the United States was that it made New Orleans one of the most important cities in the country. And here's why. Most Americans lived along the East Coast. And remember, these early years of the United States were before the invention of the telegraph. And so communication was slow and difficult. Now, as we move into the 1800s, Americans began moving west. Many of them moved along the Mississippi River because that was the easiest way to travel west, and that meant that over time, New Orleans became a very important city. Now, to understand how that worked exactly, imagine yourself as a farmer in the early 1800s. You've heard about this amazing land out west in the Mississippi Valley, and so you decide to grab your family and head west. Where are you going to stop along the way? Well, you might stop in Cincinnati, Ohio, or maybe Louisville, Kentucky, or maybe Memphis, Tennessee. These were all stops along the river that offered services to travelers. They had inns where you could rest, maybe a blacksmith to repair your wagon. But eventually you will need to stop for supplies. Your food will run low, and you're going to need to purchase more food, and you're going to do that in New Orleans. And so every single person who traveled west stopped in New Orleans to purchase supplies. And over time, that made it one of the largest cities in the United States. In fact, by 1860, it was the second largest city in the country behind only New York. Okay. Finally, let's think about how the Mississippi River facilitated transportation and trade with Europe and Asia. Okay, so farmers are shipping their goods to New Orleans. Businessmen are shipping their manufactured goods to New Orleans. People are traveling to New Orleans for all kinds of reasons. How did they get those people and those goods to the ocean? Well, from New Orleans, they took a steamboat down to the Gulf of Mexico and then boarded a ship that went across the Atlantic Ocean. But wait a minute, if they traveled down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico and then went across the ocean, doesn't that mean that they're going in the opposite direction? Yes, it does. But listen, when you're talking about trade and international relations, you don't call it going to the east or the west. You call it exporting or importing. Exporting means that you're sending something out of the country. Importing means that you're bringing something into the country. So for example, if you buy a shirt at Walmart, and that shirt was manufactured in Bangladesh, that shirt was imported into the United States. The Mississippi River facilitated exports from the United States. If you want to send something to Europe or Asia, you must first get it to the ocean. And the Mississippi River was the best way to do that if you lived west of the Mississippi River. And that ends our look at Chapter 2. Not too bad, huh? Well, if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam, then click right here in the review packet, and all your dreams will come true. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the Louisiana Purchase. In our last chapter, we saw Spain reluctantly take control of the massive Louisiana territory from France. But the world was changing fast, and the turn of the 19th century brought with it a seismic shift in global power, one that would put Louisiana right back in the hands of its original European owner. Today, in Chapter 3, we're talking about France's dramatic and clandestine return to North America. So, let's set the scene. It's the late 1790s. Europe is in turmoil, thanks to the French Revolution and the meteoric rise of a certain military genius, Napoleon Bonaparte. While America was trying to find its footing as a new nation, Napoleon was busy redrawing the map of Europe. He had grand ambitions, and they weren't limited to the Old World. He dreamt of a new, glorious French Empire, and a key piece of that puzzle lay across the Atlantic. For years, French diplomats had been working behind the scenes, pressuring Spain to return the Louisiana territory. Spain, by this point, was a declining power. Managing the vast, sparsely populated, and expensive Louisiana colony was a constant headache. It was a financial drain, and defending it against American expansion was proving to be a massive challenge. To the Spanish crown, Louisiana was becoming more of a liability than an asset. Napoleon saw this weakness and exploited it brilliantly. He made Spain an offer it couldn't really refuse. Through a series of negotiations, shrouded in secrecy, he promised the Spanish king, Charles IV, something very appealing. A kingdom in Italy for his son. In exchange, Spain would give Louisiana back to France. This all culminated on October 1st, 1800, with the signing of the secret Third Treaty of San Ildefonso. The keyword here is secret. Napoleon insisted that the deal be kept completely under wraps. Why? Because he didn't want to alarm the two other major players with a stake in the region, Great Britain and the United States. Britain, France's mortal enemy, had a powerful navy that could easily blockade and seize Louisiana if they knew it was back in French hands. Napoleon needed time to build up his own forces and secure the territory before Britain could react. And then there was the United States. President Thomas Jefferson and his administration were already wary of having a weak Spain as their neighbor. The idea of having the aggressive expansion and incredibly powerful Napoleonic France controlling the Mississippi River and the vital port of New Orleans was the stuff of nightmares. For American farmers and merchants west of the Appalachian Mountains, The Mississippi River was their highway to the world. They floated their goods, flour, tobacco, pork, lumber down the river to New Orleans, where they were loaded onto ocean-going ships. The right to deposit these goods in New Orleans, tax-free, was guaranteed by a treaty with Spain. It was the lifeblood of the Western American economy. If that right was revoked, or if access was controlled by a hostile power, it could cripple the young nation's growth and potentially even lead to the Western states breaking away from the Union. The rumors of the secret treaty began to leak out, and a wave of anxiety swept through the United States. Official denials came from both French and Spanish diplomats, but the whispers persisted. Thomas Jefferson, a known Francophile who had initially celebrated the French Revolution, was now deeply troubled. He famously wrote that the day that France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. This was a shocking statement coming from Jefferson. It showed just how serious the threat was. Alliance with Britain, the former colonial master, was the last thing he wanted, but the prospect of a powerful French empire on America's doorstep was even worse. Napoleon's plan for his new American empire was ambitious. The centerpiece was the colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. This was the jewel of the French colonial crown, the world's leading producer of sugar and coffee, and incredibly profitable. Napoleon envisioned Louisiana as the breadbasket for it would supply the food, timber, and other resources needed to support the massive enslaved population that worked the plantations, making the French Caribbean colonies self-sufficient and even more valuable. With a secure food source from Louisiana, Napoleon could project French power throughout the Caribbean and the Americas. But there was a huge obstacle to Napoleon's grand design. In Saint-Domingue, a massive and successful slave rebellion was raging, led by the brilliant General Toussaint Louverture. The formerly enslaved people of Haiti had fought for and won their freedom, establishing their own government. Before Napoleon could make his American empire a reality, he first had to crush this rebellion and re-establish French authority in slavery. In 1802, Napoleon dispatched a massive military expedition, tens of thousands of his best troops, under the command of his own brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc. His orders were clear: subdue the rebels, capturer Louverture, and restore the old colonial order. This campaign, he believed, would be a swift and decisive victory, paving the way for him to then send another force to formally occupy Louisiana. Back in America, the tension reached a boiling point in October 1802. The Spanish official, still in charge of New Orleans, acting on secret orders likely prompted by the French, suddenly revoked America's right of deposit. Just like that, the port was close to American goods. Panic erupted in the American West. Farmers and merchants were furious. There were loud calls for war, for an immediate military seizure of New Orleans. The Westerners were ready to march. President Jefferson was in a tight spot. He had to calm the public outcry and find a diplomatic solution before the situation spiraled into a war. He knew the young country couldn't afford to fight, especially against Napoleon's France. The crisis forced Jefferson's hand. He knew he had to act decisively. He needed to secure American access to the Mississippi permanently. And so, he devised a plan. He would send a special envoy to Paris to negotiate with Napoleon himself. The goal wasn't to buy all of Louisiana. That idea was still unthinkable. The mission, at first, was much more limited: to purchase the city of New Orleans and the territories of West Florida, securing the mouth of the Mississippi for the United States forever. This sets the stage for one of the most dramatic negotiations in history. Jefferson was sending his diplomats into the heart of European power politics to bargain with the most powerful man in the world. The fate of the American continent hung in the balance, but what they would find in Paris was a situation that had changed dramatically, thanks to unforeseen events unfolding hundreds of miles away in the Caribbean. The dream of a French empire in America was about to collide with a harsh reality, and that's where we'll pick up next time. We'll see how the heroic resistance in Haiti and a series of devastating setbacks completely upended Napoleon's plans, forcing him to make a decision that would change the course of American history forever. Thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying this series, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. We love reading your comments, so please share your thoughts below. See you next time. Okay, I've got an interesting question for you. How do you balance the desire for territorial growth with the principles of limited government? And if you can figure that out, you will have won the secret to success in American politics. Seriously, though this is a pretty good question, and it is one that our fourth president, Thomas Jefferson, grappled with quite a bit. In Chapter 4, which is titled Jefferson's Dilemma, author John Meacham introduces us to the issue that Jefferson faced early in his presidency. You see, Jefferson was a believer in republicanism, which meant that he believed in expanding the territory of the United States because more land meant more opportunity for farmers. He also, however, believed in limiting the size and scope of the federal government. This meant that as president, he had to decide whether or not to send the army into Mexico to conquer more land for the United States. Sending an army anywhere would expand the power of the federal government, something that Jefferson was philosophically opposed to. Now, before we get to how Jefferson dealt with this dilemma, if you're enjoying this video and want to help out, please make sure to subscribe. It really does help me out. Okay, so here's the situation that Jefferson found himself in. First of all, in the late 18th century and early 19th century, there were two great powers in North America, Spain and France. Okay, fine, we know that already, but those two European nations had completely different approaches to dealing with the colonies they owned in North America. Spain believed in keeping their North American colonies tightly controlled. The Spanish colonies were run by the Spanish directly through a viceroy, and everything from taxes to trade to religion was strictly regulated by the central government in Madrid. France, on the other hand, took a much more hands-off approach. The French king granted noblemen large tracts of land in Canada and the Louisiana Territory and then let them do basically whatever they wanted. In fact, the French didn't even require that the nobles collect taxes from the settlers on their land. They just expected them to pay the king a yearly tribute. This meant that while Spain had large, well-organized colonies that were very loyal to the crown, France's colonies were kind of a mess. There was no real system of taxation, so the colonial governments couldn't fund things like schools or roads. Also, since there was no organized system of government, many of the colonies were just kind of run by whoever was the strongest. And so, at this time period, the Mississippi River and the city of New Orleans were actually controlled by the British. Now, this wasn't ideal for a number of reasons. First of all, Americans relied on the port of New Orleans to export their agricultural goods. Also, controlling the Mississippi River gave the British a major advantage in any potential conflict between the United States and Spain. Jefferson knew this and realized that the only way for the United States to grow and prosper was to annex to Louisiana territory and end British control of the Mississippi River. But this presented him with a sort of philosophical problem. As a strict constructionist, he believed that the Constitution did not explicitly give the president the power to acquire new territories, and Jefferson was loath to admit that Congress didn't have the power to do this either, because that would go against his belief in republicanism. So what was Jefferson to do? Should he ignore his philosophical beliefs about the proper role of government in order to acquire more land for the United States? Or should he let the British continue to control the Mississippi River and effectively doom the western half of the country? Well, thankfully for both Jefferson and the future of the United States, he came up with a third option, which was to try to purchase New Orleans from the French. To be fair, Jefferson might have been able to get away with this plan if Napoleon had decided to have a massive meltdown and sell all of France's territory in North America to the United States. But that's an entirely different story for a different video. Let me explain. First of all, when Jefferson first took office, he sent James Monroe to Paris to try to purchase New Orleans from the French. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I need to tell you that I am kind of making up the details of this story. The truth is that there is very little information available about what happened in Paris during Jefferson's first term. All we know is that James Monroe went over there and tried to buy New Orleans, and that Napoleon said no. So let me fill in the blanks with some historical fiction, which, by the way, is totally legitimate in an AP government classroom. Anyway, as the story goes, Monroe went to Napoleon and offered to purchase New Orleans, and in exchange, the United States would assume all debts incurred by the French colony. Napoleon thought about this for a second and then burst out laughing. "You want to buy New Orleans from me? Why would I do that?" Monroe responded by saying that if Napoleon didn't agree to the deal, then the United States would go to war with France. Of course, This was just a bluff because Jefferson had just been elected on an anti-war platform and he was very serious about not starting a war with France. Still, Napoleon just laughed and told Monroe to take his offer and shove it. So Monroe returned home, empty-handed and defeated. Now, there's a couple of important things to note here. First of all, while Jefferson succeeded in avoiding a war with France, he failed in his goal of purchasing New Orleans, and this was a big disappointment for a number of reasons. First of all, Jefferson was concerned that the continued French presence in North America threatened American independence. Remember, Jefferson had written extensively about the dangers of entangling alliances with European powers, and he was worried that the French could use their colonial holdings to meddle in American politics. Secondly, the continued French presence in North America meant that the United States could never really grow to its fullest potential. For example, if the U.S. ever wanted to control the Mississippi River, they would have to go to war with the French, which Jefferson didn't want to do. Finally, the inability to acquire New Orleans meant that the United States would never be able to compete economically with the British, since the port of New Orleans was so vital to the American economy. The inability to control it meant that the United States would forever be dependent on the British for trade. And again, this was something that Jefferson desperately did not want. So while Jefferson was correct in his prediction that the continued French presence in North America would eventually lead to war, he could not have imagined that it would happen in the way that it did. After the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon needed money to rebuild his military and his economy, and he desperately needed the West Indies to generate revenue for France. Now, if you're not familiar with the Haitian Revolution, basically a group of slaves revolted and overthrew their French masters. This caused Napoleon to lose a valuable colony that was generating a lot of wealth for France. In order to make up for this loss, he decided to sell all of France's North American territory to the United States. Now, at this point, you might be asking yourself, why would France give up such a huge chunk of land to the United States? I mean, if they sold Louisiana to the United States, doesn't that give the U.S. control of the Mississippi River? And doesn't that hurt France's ability to trade? Well, yes, it does. And the reason that France agreed to this deal is basically because they didn't care. By the early 1800s, European powers were beginning to turn away from colonialism and focus more on industrialization, and France was no exception. Napoleon was desperate for money to rebuild his economy after the Haitian Revolution, and he hoped that by selling Louisiana to the United States, he could generate enough revenue to accomplish this goal. Secondly, Napoleon was focused primarily on conquering Europe and ruling all of the countries there. He basically didn't care what happened in North America. And finally, Napoleon was a believer in the idea that if you can't beat them, join them. He figured that the United States and France shared too many commonalities to ever really go to war. So by selling Louisiana to the United States, he figured that he would simply create another ally for France. Anyway, the Louisiana Purchase included roughly 828,000 square miles of land and cost the United States $15 million. This doubled the size of the young nation and secured American control of the Mississippi River. Okay, thanks for watching. Alright, it's time to get back to work and start talking about the Louisiana Purchase in more depth. So let's talk about Chapter 5. The American Delegation. This chapter is all about how the United States sent a delegation to France to try to buy New Orleans, and maybe some of the surrounding areas as well. So this was obviously before the United States had control of any part of the Mississippi River. They only had control of the port of New Orleans, and that was a big problem because now they were landlocked. The entire purpose of the United States was to expand westward, but if they didn't have control over the Mississippi River, that was going to be really difficult to do. So the first step is Jefferson sends Robert Livingston to France to act as minister to France. And he has a pretty modest goal. He wants to secure just New Orleans and navigation rights on the Mississippi River. That's it. Just those two things. Now, when Livingston left for France, Jefferson also sent him a secret message with instructions to not come back without New Orleans, which is an interesting way to motivate your guy. Like, hey, go over there, make this happen. Oh, and by the way, don't come home without it. That'll be awkward. Anyway, while Livingston was in France negotiating, James Monroe, who was the minister in London, was recalled from his post, and he joined Livingston in Paris. And so now these two guys are working together trying to figure out how they can purchase New Orleans, and the navigation rights of the Mississippi River. Napoleon was actually really happy to see Monroe because they had been corresponding before this, before Monroe went to London, and they kind of developed a friendship. And Napoleon was like, "Oh, Monroe's here. This is great. We can get along really well. I like this guy." And he was hoping that Monroe would put in a good word for him back in the United States. So Napoleon was like, "Yay. Monroe, you're here. Let's do some stuff." Now, when Livingston arrived in France, Napoleon was demanding $2 million for New Orleans. And Livingston was like, "Oh, okay, well, we've got $2 million, but we want navigation rights too. Can you throw that in there?" And Napoleon was like, "No." And then Livingston said, "Well, how about $60 million? And Napoleon was like, "Deal? Okay, I guess I'm sold. That's what I wanted. I'm gonna take the $60 million and run." "No, just kidding. Still not gonna give you the navigation rights." So then Livingston was like, all right, well then we're not gonna pay you anything and we're just gonna take it. And Napoleon was like, okay, if you take it, I guess it's yours." And again, he was just joking, obviously, because he never intended to sell New Orleans or give up the navigation rights to the Mississippi River. There's no way he was going to do that. Even though Napoleon was basically giving these guys the runaround, Monroe and Livingston were able to meet with Napoleon on several occasions. And during one of these meetings, Napoleon outlined his vision for the future of France. And he talked about how he wanted to reassert French dominance in North America. And he explained to them his plans to rebuild the Western Hemisphere in 3 separate spheres of influence. One for the British, one for the Spanish, and one for himself. And he felt like he needed the Mississippi River in order to assert French influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Americans were, understandably, pretty skeptical of Napoleon's grand plans, but they did listen patiently. And at the end of this meeting, Napoleon asked them what they could offer France in exchange for the city of New Orleans. And remember, their goal was just to secure the port of New Orleans. So they offered him 60 million francs, which at the time was about $2 million. And Napoleon just laughed at them and said, "No, you need to give me 10 times that much money." And then he stormed off. After that meeting, Livingston and Monroe decided they were you and gone now be able to come to an agreement with Napoleon regarding New Orleans. And so they went ahead and just took it. Okay, I'm just kidding. They didn't actually do that. Instead, they went back to the United States and told Jefferson it wasn't going well. And then they waited to see what he would say. Jefferson was not pleased when he heard that the negotiations had failed. He was very upset that they couldn't come to an agreement with Napoleon. But rather than just declaring war on France and taking the port of New Orleans anyway, which is something he probably could have done, he decided to send James Monroe back to France with even more authority to negotiate a peace treaty. When Monroe went back to France, Napoleon was actually really excited. He thought, "Oh, wow, Monroe's back. Maybe he's going to give me a lot of money." But Monroe was like, "No, I am actually here to tell you that President Jefferson is authorized to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and also the interior navigation of the Mississippi River." And Napoleon was like, "Whoa, hold up. You mean like the whole thing?" Yeah, I think we want the whole thing. I'll tell you what, let's do it." "Okay, I'm just kidding." He didn't do that either. Napoleon continued to stall for time and basically just gave them the runaround. And then eventually he just straight up told them, "No, I'm not gonna do it. I am not gonna give you the Mississippi River, and I am definitely not gonna give you the port of New Orleans. In fact, I'm not even gonna sell you Louisiana." At this point, the Americans were getting pretty frustrated because here they were offering Napoleon more and more money and he just kept raising the price. And it got to the point where he wouldn't even negotiate anymore. He was just saying, "Nope, I want $10 billion. And then the Americans were like, "Are you kidding me? You're not getting $10 billion. And Napoleon was like, "Okay, fine, bye." So the Americans weren't really sure what to do next. They could declare war on France and try to take Louisiana by force, but that would be a long and expensive process, and they were unreally sure that they could win. The Americans were also worried that if they went to war with France, Spain might jump into the action, and then suddenly the Americans would be fighting on 2 fronts. Now, while all of this was going on, there were rumblings throughout the United States about the acquisition of Canada. Many Americans felt that in order for the United States to really become a strong Western nation, they needed to annex Canada. They needed more territory in the northern part of the continent. The American president at the time, James Madison, responded to these critics by writing a letter explaining why he did not support an invasion of Canada. And in this letter, he explained that invading Canada would cause the United States to go to war with both Britain and Spain. And he said, no, we're not going to do that. So that kind of put an end to any thoughts of invading Canada. All right, so check it out. If you're enjoying this video, you're really helping me out by liking and subscribing. All right, back to the video. Now, at this point, James Monroe was ready to give up on the idea of purchasing New Orleans from France because he knew that Napoleon was just playing games with him. So he came up with another plan. He was going to steal it. Just kidding. He wasn't really going to steal it, but he did propose a different solution. Instead of buying New Orleans and the navigation rights to the Mississippi River, the United States should buy all of Louisiana. James Monroe proposed that they offer Napoleon $10 million for all of Louisiana and the navigation rights to the Mississippi River. And this was actually a really good deal for Napoleon because at this point he was still having problems with the British and the Spanish. He was also aware that he didn't have enough resources to properly manage Louisiana, and he desperately needed some extra money. So he accepted the offer and sold Louisiana to the United States for $15 million. Now, to be clear, Napoleon originally intended to sell all of Louisiana to the Spanish. He wanted to sell it to them first. But when they refused, he then offered it to the British. And they refused. And then, finally, he offered it to the Americans, and they accepted. So Napoleon never really intended to sell Louisiana to the United States, but he did accept their offer because he needed money. All right, click right over here to keep reviewing for Unit 4, and I'll see you in the next video.
Okay, we've just finished Chapter 6, Napoleon's Changing Fortunes. Let's take a look at what happened. So, Chapter 6 opens with Napoleon being celebrated as a great general for winning battles in Italy, but he is not so popular at home. Why? Well, France has been fighting a lot of expensive wars in Europe, and the money has to come from somewhere. The taxes are high and the people are grumbling. As always, let's take a look at the financial situation. In 1792, the French government had a budget deficit of 1.3 billion livres. In 1794, it was 2.4 billion. And by 1799, it was a staggering 4.8 billion. To make matters worse, the French economy was saddled with a huge debt from the war. In 1792, the debt stood at 5.3 billion livres. By 1799, it had risen to 7.3 billion. So the French needed a way out. They were spending too much and borrowing too much money. They needed to get out of debt. How could they do that? Well, there were two ways to go about it. The first option was to stop borrowing money. Easy, right? No more debt. Unfortunately, this would mean higher taxes. And, as we all know, people don't like paying taxes. Now, you might say, why don't you just cut military spending? After all, you're not at war. But here's the thing. During the French Revolution, the sans-culottes were so obsessed with defending the homeland that cutting military spending was unthinkable. They wanted to spend even more money on the military. You see, after the storming of the Bastille, revolutionary fervor swept through France. People felt that the old regime was corrupt and inefficient. There was no way they were going to give up their hard-earned gains. The French public wanted to keep the revolution going. And how do you do that? Well, with money, of course. They wanted to export the revolution around the world. But where would that money come from? Well, that's where the second option comes in. Raise money from overseas. And this is where Napoleon comes in. He wants to conquer new territories in the Caribbean and in Africa. These areas are full of riches and resources, perfect for extracting wealth. And who cares if these regions are inhabited by people who have a different culture or religion? That's not important. What's important is that they have gold. Napoleon didn't care about human rights or freedom. He only cared about power and glory. And he believed that conquering new lands would bring both. And that's what we discuss in Chapter 6. We see how Napoleon's plans for the Caribbean and Africa fell apart, and how he became interested in Europe instead. But before we get into that, now back to the video. So Napoleon was on the prowl for colonial possessions in the Caribbean. And there was one island in particular that caught his eye, Saint-Domingue. Today, we know it as Haiti, but back then it was known as Saint-Domingue. It was the most prosperous colony in the entire Caribbean. The island was a sugar plantation, and the profits from sugar were astronomical. Saint-Domingue produced 40% of the sugar consumed in Europe and 60% of the coffee. In fact, the colony's economy was larger than that of Great Britain. If Napoleon could conquer this island, he would be set for life. But there was a problem. Saint-Domingue was already occupied. Who was in charge? Well, it depended on when you asked. You see, the island had been a French colony since 1625, but the French weren't the original inhabitants. The Arawakan Carib Indians were the first inhabitants of the island, but by the late 18th century, they were long gone. The Spanish and English had also tried to claim the island, but failed. It was officially a French colony, but in reality, it was a mess. The island was divided into 3 sections. The north was controlled by the French colonial government. The south was owned by white planters. And in between was the middle section, which was mostly controlled by free people of color. It was a patchwork quilt of cultures and races. And this made governing very difficult. There were constant rebellions and uprisings. And Napoleon thought that if he took over, he could restore order. Unfortunately for Napoleon, he wasn't the only one who thought the island was ripe for the picking. The British had their eyes on the prize as well. And so began the Battle of Cap François. It was a fight between the French, the British, and the rebels for control of the island. Napoleon sent in some troops to help the French colonial government, but they weren't enough. There simply weren't enough ships to transport troops across the Atlantic. So Napoleon was forced to rely on the rebels. This turned out to be a big mistake. You see, the rebels had been fighting for their freedom for years. They were tired of being ruled by the French colonial government and the white planters. And when Napoleon offered them a deal, they refused. He promised them citizenship and equality if they would help him defeat the British. But they wanted more. They wanted independence. Led by Toussaint Louverture, the rebels fought on. They defeated the French, drove out the British, and took control of the island. Napoleon was furious. He couldn't believe that a bunch of slaves and freedmen had taken over such a valuable colony. He vowed to punish them and sent in General Leclerc to put down the rebellion. But Leclerc was defeated as well. Toussaint Louverture was captured and sent to prison in France, where he died. But the revolution continued. In 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines led the remaining rebels to victory. Saint-Domingue was no longer a French colony. It was an independent nation. Napoleon had failed to conquer the island. His dream of a Caribbean empire was over. But Napoleon was not one to give up easily. He tried again in Africa, but he failed again. So he decided to try somewhere else. And that somewhere else was Europe. It was a continent full of wealth and resources, and it was ripe for the taking. All Napoleon had to do was convince the other European powers to let him have it. He started by making an alliance with Britain. Together, they invaded Santo Domingo and took control of it. Then he turned his attention to the Dutch. He offered to buy their colony of Suriname, but they refused, so he invaded that colony, too. By 1801, Napoleon had conquered most of South America. But, as we've seen in previous chapters, there was a problem. The people in these colonies didn't want to be ruled by outsiders. They wanted independence. So Napoleon was forced to sign peace treaties with the Dutch and the British. He gained nothing from his invasion of South America. By 1802, Napoleon was desperate. He needed money, and he needed it fast. And he knew just the place to get it. Egypt was rich in resources and ripe for the taking. So Napoleon assembled a massive army and set sail for the Suez Canal. He took control of Egypt easily. The Egyptians were no match for the French army. But Napoleon's problems back home were mounting. The peace treaties he had signed in South America were unpopular in France. The people wanted revenge against the Dutch and the British. And Napoleon needed to find a way to satisfy them. He tried making a peace treaty with Austria, but that failed. So he went to war with them. It was a disaster. Napoleon was defeated and forced to flee to Elba. He was exiled from France. So what did he do? He escaped and returned to France. He rallied the people to his side and marched on Paris. The Austrians tried to stop him, but they failed. Napoleon was back in power, but he was a changed man. He was older, wiser, more cautious. He knew that he couldn't win a war against the Austrians and the British. He needed to find a way to defeat them without risking his own army. And that's when he had his epiphany. He would defeat them at sea. Napoleon assembled a navy and set sail for the Mediterranean. He won a series of brilliant victories, defeating the Austrian and British navies. He controlled the Mediterranean. And now he was ready to finish the job. He marched on Vienna and forced the Austrians to sign a peace treaty. He had defeated the Austrians and secured his position in Europe. Napoleon was at the height of his power. Unfortunately, he wouldn't enjoy it for long. That's because the British were preparing to invade. And we'll talk about that in the next video. But before we go, let me ask you a question. Why do you think Napoleon gave up on his plans for the Caribbean and Africa? Oh, was it because he was defeated, or was it because he realized that he couldn't win? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Okay, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. Thanks for watching.
Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7. A surprising offer. A moment that would fundamentally reshape the United States. Our story picks up with the American negotiators, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, in Paris. Their mission, handed down by President Thomas Jefferson, was clear and relatively modest. Secured the port of New Orleans and, if possible, parts of Florida. This was all about ensuring American farmers could freely use the Mississippi River to get their goods to market. A vital economic lifeline was at stake, and Jefferson was willing to pay up to $10 million for it. The stakes were high. Control of New Orleans had recently passed from Spain back to France, and the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte loomed large. Napoleon was a military genius with grand ambitions for a new French empire in North America. The Americans were understandably nervous. A powerful, expansionist France at their western border was a far more daunting prospect than a declining Spanish empire. So, Livingston and Monroe went to Paris with a specific, limited goal. They were prepared for tough negotiations, perhaps even a flat-out refusal. What they weren't prepared for was the bombshell that was about to be dropped. The negotiations began as expected, with the French Foreign Minister, Talleyrand, playing coy. He initially showed little interest in even discussing New Orleans. Livingston pressed the American case, highlighting the strategic importance of the port to the United States and the potential for conflict if American access was denied. Days turned into weeks, and frustration began to mount. Monroe arrived in Paris to reinforce the American position, but the outlook still seemed bleak. Napoleon appeared focused on his New World ambitions, centered around the valuable sugar-producing colony of Saint-Domingue, what we now know as Haiti. The vast Louisiana territory was meant to be the breadbasket for this colony, supplying it with all the necessary food and resources. It seemed Napoleon had no reason to sell. But then, everything changed. And it changed because of events happening thousands of miles away, on a Caribbean island. A massive, and ultimately successful, slave rebellion in St. led by the brilliant Toussaint Louverture, had thrown Napoleon's plans into chaos. French forces sent to crush the rebellion were decimated, not just by the determined rebels, but also by yellow fever. Without the profitable sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, Napoleon's vision for a North American empire began to crumble. The vast, untamed Louisiana territory suddenly looked less like a strategic asset and more like a liability. It was difficult to defend, expensive to administer, and with war against Britain once again brewing on the horizon, Napoleon needed cash. And he needed it fast. This brings us to the pivotal moment. During a casual conversation, the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, turned to the American negotiators and asked a question that must have made their jaws drop. He asked, "What would you give for the whole of Louisiana?" The whole of Louisiana? Livingston and Monroe were stunned into silence. They had come to buy a city, and now they were being offered a continent. This wasn't part of their instructions. They had authorization for $10 million for New Orleans. But this was something else. Entirely, Talleyrand was proposing the sale of the entire Louisiana territory. Let's just take a moment to absorb the sheer scale of what was being offered. We're not talking about a small parcel of land. The Louisiana territory was an immense expanse of over 828,000 square miles. To put that in perspective, this single purchase would effectively double the size of the young United States overnight. It stretched from the Mississippi River in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west, and from the Gulf of Mexico all the way north to the Canadian border. This territory would eventually be carved up to create all or part of 15 future American states. It was a land of untold resources, mighty rivers, vast plains, and immense potential. And it was all on the table. Livingston and Monroe were in a bind. They were diplomats, not kings. They had no authority to make a deal of this magnitude. Communication with Washington, D.C. was painfully slow in 1803. A round trip for instructions would take months. By the time a message reached President Jefferson and a reply was sent back, the opportunity could vanish. Napoleon was notoriously impulsive. His offer might be withdrawn as quickly as it was made, especially if his military or financial situation changed. The window of opportunity was small, and the American negotiators knew they had to act decisively. They were stunned, but they were also savvy. They quickly recovered from their initial shock and recognized the monumental importance of the moment. This was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to secure the future of their nation, to ensure its westward expansion, and to remove a powerful European rival from their backyard. They had to take the chance. They entered into intense, rapid-fire negotiations. The French initially asked for a much higher price, but both sides were motivated to make a deal. The Americans wanted the land, and Napoleon desperately needed the money for his upcoming war with Great Britain. After some quick and tense haggling, they arrived at a final figure: $15 million. That's about 3 cents an acre. It's widely considered one of the greatest bargains in history. Think about that. For $15 million, the United States was about to acquire a territory that would double its size and set the stage for its rise as a continental power. Livingston and Monroe, acting far beyond their official mandate, took a massive gamble. They agreed to the terms, hoping that President Jefferson and the U.S. Congress would see the incredible wisdom of their decision. When the treaty was signed, Livingston famously remarked, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives." He understood the gravity of what they had just accomplished. They hadn't just bought a port, they had purchased an empire. This surprising offer, born from Napoleon's European ambitions and his failures in the Caribbean, had presented the United States with an opportunity that would define its destiny for centuries to come. The news now had to travel across the Atlantic, where it would land on the desk of a president who had to reconcile this incredible and constitutionally questionable deal with his own principles of government. The story of the Louisiana Purchase was far from over. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of our story. It's these incredible, unexpected moments that make history so fascinating. If you enjoyed this video and want to find out what happens next, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next episode. We'll see you next time.
Chapter 8: Negotiations and Agreement. We've been talking about Napoleon for like a year straight now, so if you feel like your knowledge of Napoleonic history is a bit rusty, we have just the thing to jog your memory. A full playlist covering all of his glory and conquests can be found right here, so go ahead and give it a watch. But anyways, let's get into the video. The French Directory government had a decision to make. Should they accept the American offer of $15 million for the Louisiana Territory? It was a lot of money, more than the French government had even expected. But at the same time, giving up this territory, which they had just recently acquired, seemed unwise. On top of that, there were rumors that Britain might be preparing an invasion of France itself, and so the government had a hard decision to make. Now, as we discussed last episode, they ultimately decided to take the deal with America, and on April 30th, 1803, the Treaty of San Ildefonso was signed in Paris. It officially ceded the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States, and for good measure, it also made Spain and Portugal allies of France. That way, if Britain did invade France, they would have to contend with Spanish and Portuguese forces as well. But today, we're not going to talk about that treaty. Instead, we'll focus solely on the negotiations that led up to it. We'll talk about how the two sides went from angry enemies to agreeing on a price to eventually shaking hands and making peace. So sit back, relax, and let's go back in time to 1802. The year before, Napoleon had seized territories around the world, including the island of Santo Domingo, which was a colony owned by France. But their rule over the island was incredibly difficult, because most of the people who lived there were slaves who hated the French. After struggling to keep control of the area, Napoleon decided to sell it to the Americans for $15 million. But the French Directory government wasn't happy with the deal. They didn't think that Napoleon had the authority to sell such valuable land without consulting them first. Not to mention, they thought that he lowballed them when setting the price. And so they began negotiating with the Americans themselves, trying to get a better deal. The French government sent an envoy to the US, named François Graverol, but he didn't actually have much leverage. You see, When Napoleon offered to sell the territory to the Americans, he also gave them an alternative option. If the French Directory refused to accept the deal, then Napoleon would simply keep Santo Domingo and use the $15 million to improve his fortifications in Europe. This meant that the US had very little incentive to negotiate with the French government. If they wanted the land, they could just pay Napoleon directly and take it. But despite this, the French government still tried. They asked the US to raise their offer to $20 million, and when President Thomas Jefferson refused, they took their offer off the table. Now, after the French pulled out, Robert R. Livingston and James Monroe, who were the American ministers to France, had to report what happened back home. In their reports, they used some pretty colorful language to describe the French Directory government. Here is just one example. The Directory is corrupt, ununited, and incapable of doing anything. In fact, they wrote, it is impossible for anyone to say what is the real cause of any given event, as no one can penetrate the secrets of an assembly where all that goes to form opinion is intrigue, corruption, and personal interest. After receiving these reports, President Jefferson decided to send a new set of negotiators to France to try once again to purchase the territory. He chose James Monroe and a man named William C. Claiborne. When they arrived in France, they met with members of the Directory government, who told them point blank that they couldn't make a deal. As Monroe wrote in his own report about the meeting, they said that France would never consent to the proposition from us, which was to buy the whole or any part of the territory of Louisiana from us. Neither would they on any account come to an arrangement by which we should take it. Essentially, the French government was saying that they'd rather give the territory to Napoleon to defend against a British invasion than give it to the Americans. This really frustrated the US because they felt like the French were deliberately trying to lead them on. But luckily, while in Paris, Monroe and Claiborne had the opportunity to meet with Napoleon as well. They laid out the exact same offer that they had made to the Directory, but they simply offered it to Napoleon directly. And to their surprise, Napoleon agreed. He was excited at the prospect of selling the territory, because he desperately needed the money. As it turned out, the reason why he sold Santo Domingo to the Americans in the first place was because he needed money to fund his wars in Europe. Selling the Louisiana territory would give him a war chest that he could use to build up his army and navy. Now, the only problem was that the French government wasn't aware of this meeting until after it happened. When they found out, they were furious. They threatened to arrest Napoleon and bring him back to France to stand trial for selling territory without the government's permission. But Napoleon wouldn't allow this. He had too much power in France for the government to do anything to him. And so the two sides began negotiating back and forth, until finally on April, they reached an agreement. The French government accepted $15 million for the Louisiana territory. Now, that isn't to say that they were happy about it. In fact, the head of the Directory, Paul Barras, told Napoleon's representative, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, that they were only accepting the deal because of the circumstances. Barras said, under present circumstances, the sale of Louisiana to the United States for $15 million is preferable to the alternative. The alternative being, of course, that Napoleon keeps the territory and uses it to defend against the British. But in reality, it doesn't make any difference to us whether Louisiana belongs to Spain, Portugal, England, or America. What matters is to prevent its becoming a fortified and independent state. And so the deal was struck. The two former enemies shook hands and agreed to end their conflict over the territory peacefully. There were celebrations in both France and the United States, and even Napoleon was happy with the deal. He wrote to his brother Joseph that the sale of Louisiana would give him the resources to build a powerful navy. He said, "The United States have just paid us $15 million for some useless land, which will serve as a rampart against the British. With this money, I shall have a powerful navy. Mark my words. I shall make France a great naval power." The official documents relating to the transaction were drawn up by a team of lawyers from both countries and signed on. April 30, 1803, it read, "France cedes to the United States all the territories which he has acquired by the surrender of that of Louisiana, with the full right of sovereignty and property, as well as the revenues which may be derived from the transfer of this territory and from the use of the navigation of the Mississippi. In exchange, the United States agrees to pay to the French government the sum of 15 million livres. The territory that was being transferred was enormous. It included basically all of the land west of the Mississippi River, north of the Mexican border, and south of the Canadian border. It included modern-day Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Minnesota. Basically any state that's west of the Mississippi River, aside from Texas, was part of the deal. The US didn't know exactly how big the territory was, but they estimated that it was about 800,000 square leagues. However, the actual size of the territory was closer to 2 million square leagues. So basically the Americans got way more land than they were even bargaining for. Alright guys, that's the end of part 6. Like always, thank you guys so much for watching, and a huge shout out to our supporters. Your support helps us to keep making these videos, and we really appreciate it. As always, if you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up button below and consider subscribing. We've got a ton of other videos on Napoleon and ancient Rome. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome back to the channel. Last time, we left Napoleon making an offer that would change the course of American history forever. Today, we re-dive into the explosive reactions back in the United States when news of the Louisiana Purchase finally arrived. Imagine this. A letter lands on President Thomas Jefferson's desk, not with a deal for New Orleans, but for the entire Louisiana Territory, for a price that was an absolute steal. Jefferson, a man who dreamed of an agrarian republic, an empire of liberty stretching across the continent, should have been ecstatic, right? Well, he was, and he wasn't. On one hand, this was the deal of a lifetime. It would double the size of the young nation, secure the vital Mississippi River, and provide land for generations of American farmers. It was the physical manifestation of his grand vision. It was perfect. But there was a massive elephant in the room. The Constitution. Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government only had the powers explicitly granted to it by the Constitution. And guess what? Nowhere in the Constitution did it say a president could just go out and buy a massive chunk of foreign land. He was genuinely tormented by this. He had spent years arguing against the Federalists for overstepping their authority. And now he was about to commit what he saw as a constitutional sin of epic proportions. He even drafted a constitutional amendment to authorize this kind of purchase. But his advisors, like James Madison, warned him that the process would take too long. Napoleon was famously impatient. The deal was a now or never proposition. If they hesitated, Napoleon might change his mind, or the Spanish might object, or the British might try to seize the territory. The clock was ticking. In the end, Jefferson had to swallow his constitutional principles and make a pragmatic choice. He justified it under his treaty-making powers, arguing that the acquisition of territory was an inherent part of a treaty. It was a bit of a stretch, and neck-no-eat, but the opportunity was just too great to pass up. So, how did the American people react? For Jefferson's supporters, the Democratic Republicans, this was a monumental victory. Newspapers across the country celebrated the bargain of the century. They praised Jefferson's foresight and diplomatic skill. To them, this wasn't just a land deal. It was a triumph for the common man. It guaranteed that the United States wouldn't be hemmed in by European powers. It secured a future based on agriculture and expansion, rather than the Federalist vision of a commercial, industrial nation concentrated on the East Coast. They saw endless opportunity, new states, and a stronger, more secure republic. The price, a mere 3 cents an acre, was seen as proof of Jefferson's genius and frugality. But not everyone was popping champagne. The Federalists, Jefferson's political rivals, were absolutely furious. They saw this not as a brilliant bargain, but as a dangerous and unconstitutional power grab. Their newspapers screamed with dire warnings. Federalist leaders, like Fisher Ames of Massachusetts, predicted disaster. They argued that Jefferson had hypocritically abandoned his own principles the moment it was convenient. They claimed he had overstepped his presidential authority in a way that would make a king blush. Their criticisms went beyond just the constitutional argument. They raised some practical and, frankly, fearful questions. How could the United States possibly govern such a vast, untamed wilderness? Take it, a great waste, a wilderness unpeopled with any beings except wolves and wandering Indians. They worried it would be impossible to defend. and that the nation's resources would be drained trying to manage it. There was also a deep-seated political fear. The Federalists' power base was in the New England and Mid-Atlantic states. They worried that adding all these new Western territories would inevitably lead to new Western states. These new states would almost certainly be agricultural and align with Jefferson's Democratic Republic. The Federalists foresaw their own political influence being diluted into oblivion. They feared the balance of power would shift dramatically away from the original 13 colonies, leaving the New England states as a powerless minority in an ever-expanding union. Some of the more extreme Federalists even talked of They floated the idea that the New England states should break away and form their own confederacy rather than be dominated by the new southern and western states that were sure to be carved out of this new territory. They saw the Purchase as a fundamental threat to their way of life and their vision for America. They painted a picture of a country that was too large, too diverse, and ultimately ungovernable. So you have this incredible split screen in 1803 America. On one side, you have jubilation, parades, and toasts to President Jefferson for securing the nation's destiny. On the other, you have outrage, dire predictions of tyranny, and fears that the Republic was tearing itself apart. The debate was fierce, passionate, and it touched on the very core of what America was and what it should become. Was it a compact, coastal republic, or a sprawling continental empire? Ultimately, the allure of the land and the promise of expansion were too powerful to resist. The treaty was ratified by the Senate in October 1803 by a vote of 24-7. The Federalists' arguments, while constitutionally significant, couldn't overcome the sheer scale of the opportunity. Jefferson, the strict constructionist, had made the most expansive executive decision in American history. It was a paradox that would define his presidency and, more importantly, reshape the nation's destiny forever. The United States had doubled in size overnight, and nothing would ever be the same. What an incredible moment of national crisis and opportunity. Jefferson's gamble paid off, but the questions raised by the Federalists about expansion, governance, and the very identity of the nation would echo for decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into American history. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button, subscribe for more, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll talk about what actually happened when the U.S. took control of this vast new land. See you next time. As we continue our journey through the history of Louisiana, there's one little detail I need to address before we can move forward, namely Chapter 10, the transfer ceremony. Because when we left off in Chapter 9, Spain was still governing Louisiana. And while they had signed over the colony to France in the Treaty of Sanillan, that didn't mean that France immediately took possession of the territory. Oh no, that's not how it went down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain. But first, if you like stories like this, please hit the like button. It helps the algorithm. Also follow us on social media for more content throughout the week, and for a behind-the-scenes look at the making of these videos. So in our last episode, we learned about the signing of the Treaty of Sanillan in 18, which stipulated that Spain would cede Louisiana to France. But the actual transfer of power didn't occur until 3 years later on November of 1803. By that time, Napoleon Bonaparte was firmly in control of France, and the Louisiana Purchase was very much a thing of the past. So instead of taking possession of the entire Mississippi Valley, France only received about 72,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River, an area which today comprises the American states of Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas. Now, before we get into the details of the transfer ceremony, there's something really important that I want to point out. Namely that Spain never actually handed the territory over to France in a single ceremony. Instead, there were two separate transfer ceremonies. In the first one, France formally took possession of Louisiana from Spain. And then in the second one, the United States purchased the territory from France. So what I'm trying to say is that there was a triple transfer of power here. Spain gave it to France, who then gave it to the United States. And all this happened right here in the city of New Orleans. On October 20th, 1803, Spanish Governor Don Andres de Ulloa y Aveles stepped down and turned over the government of Louisiana to French citizens. The ceremony took place in the Spanish colonial capital of New Orleans, which was still called New Orleans at this time. And it occurred at the Ayuntamiento, which is the city's old town hall, which is now the Cabildo. This building is located on the corner of what is today called Jackson Square and Royal Street. These days it serves as a museum operated by the Louisiana State Museum, and it's actually the oldest standing public building in the city. The transfer ceremony itself was held in front of the building and began with the lowering of the flags of Spain and the United Kingdom. Now hold on, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, isn't the UK and Spain different countries? Well, at this time they were allied. You see, the Anglo-Spanish War had broken out in 1801, largely over control of the Caribbean island of Trinidad, and so Spain entered the war on the side of the British. Therefore, both their flags were flying over the city at this time. But anyway, those flags were lowered, and then the flags of France and the First French Republic were raised in their place. The crowd erupted in cheers and fireworks lit up the sky above the Mississippi River. Celebration lasted for 8 days with balls, parades, banquets, and bonfires. But just because Spain had ceded Louisiana to France, and the French had taken possession of it, that didn't mean that the transfer was complete. You see, Napoleon was looking to use the Louisiana territory as leverage against the British. He wanted to create a military stronghold in the West Indies, and he hoped to use the Mississippi River as a supply route. To do this, he needed access to the port of New Orleans, which was controlled by the Spanish. So en November, French troops occupied the city and established a military presence at the port. Then on December, Napoleon sent James Wilkinson, the former Spanish governor of Louisiana, back to New Orleans to officially take possession of the city on behalf of France. Then just a few weeks later, on January of 1804, another ceremony took place at which the flag of the First French Republic was lowered and the flag of the United States was raised in its place. The purchase price of $15 million was paid to France in the form of bonds, and the United States got a bargain. The official transfer of power was completed, and the Louisiana Purchase became official. In 2004, the 200th anniversary of the transfer ceremony was commemorated with a special ceremony in downtown New Orleans. Author John McPhee served as the keynote speaker, and the event was hosted by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. During the course of his speech, McPhee suggested that a monument be erected to commemorate the occasion, and also urged New Orleanians to learn more about the history of their city. Today, there are 2 monuments that commemorate the transfer of Louisiana from Spain to France and the United States. The first is a bronze sculpture called Le Dernier Soupir, or The Last Sigh. It depicts the figure of Louisiana as a woman who is breathing a sigh of relief as she sheds her Spanish colonial mantilla. The sculpture was created by Paul Philippe Kudami, who was born in Paris and later emigrated to New Orleans, where he worked as a portrait painter. It was dedicated on November of 1903 and can be found in Woldenberg Park at the foot of the I-310 bridge on the riverfront near downtown New Orleans. The sculpture was restored in 2003 in advance of the bicentennial. The other monument is called La Colonna, or the Column. It was erected in Jackson Square by the St. Louis Cathedral and commemorates the taking of possession of Louisiana by the French in 1803. The column was constructed from stone that came from the original Cabildo building. That's the one where the first transfer ceremony took place. The cornerstone was laid on November of 1903, and the monument was dedicated on December. It's topped with a bronze replica of the fleur de lis, which is, of course, the emblem of France. Louisiana changed hands a lot during the early years of the United States. First, it was under the control of the Spanish, then it was transferred to the French, then it was bought by the Americans. Today, it is an integral part of the United States, and the culture and history of Louisiana continues to thrive. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button. It really helps us out. And don't forget to follow us on social media for more content throughout the week. Thanks for watching.
Okay, we're back to Louisiana. We left off with the United States having just purchased a tremendous amount of land from France. This purchase would more than double the size of the young nation. But as we end our tale in Chapter 11, this immense new territory is unmapped, unknown, and its full exploration will take years. Now, before we get started, I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining me on this journey through the greatest country on earth. We are now 3/4 of the way through our first volume, and we still have many more tales to go. And if you enjoy these videos, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. These things really help us out. In the meantime, let's explore Chapter 11, Mapping the Immense New Territory. Few Americans had ever seen the lands that the United States had just acquired from France. Many Americans didn't even know exactly where the lands were. Some thought it was near the mouth of the Mississippi River, but they weren't sure. Most Americans could only imagine the possibilities of so much new territory. They knew there were vast prairies and probably lots of wild game, fertile lands for planting, and towering mountains for mining. There were also rivers, probably lots of rivers, and maybe even more importantly, people, many different people. The United States now owned all of the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. This massive region would eventually become known as the Louisiana Purchase. Within its borders were some well-known places such as New Orleans, St. Louis, and the headwaters of the Mississippi River. But most of the region was unknown to Americans. President Thomas Jefferson commissioned an expedition to explore the region and map its features. He chose Meriwether Lewis, a former secretary to President Jefferson, and William Clark, who ran a ferry across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. The two men would lead an expedition of about 40 men into the unknown over a period of roughly 2 years. They would chart the geography, document the plants and animals, and search for a practical route to the Pacific Ocean. The Corps of Discovery, as they would become known, departed from St. Louis on May 1804, traveling west along the Missouri River. The journey was long and arduous, fraught with danger at every turn. At one point, the entire company almost starved to death. But Lewis and Clark pressed on, driven by their desire to see what lay beyond the Mississippi. As they traveled, they encountered many different Native American nations, some of which were friendly and some of which were not. The Corps of Discovery was often aided by the natives, who taught them how to navigate the wilderness and find food. In return, the Americans shared their knowledge of European ways and traded goods with the natives. One native woman named Sacagawea would play a key role in the success of the expedition. She served as a guide and interpreter, and her presence helped to ease tensions with some of the Native American tribes they encountered. The Corps of Discovery finally reached the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805 after traveling nearly 8,000 miles. They had discovered many new plants and animals, and had mapped much of the region. Their journey back to St. Louis was fraught with peril, but they eventually arrived in September of 1806. The Lewis and Clark expedition was one of the greatest adventures in American history. It opened up the West to American settlement and helped to fulfill the nation's destiny as a continental power. As we end our tale in Chapter 11, it is clear that the United States has a bright future ahead of it. The nation has grown from a small area along the Atlantic coast to a vast domain stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada and from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Ocean. There are many challenges ahead, but also many opportunities. The United States is a nation of pioneers and explorers, and its people are sure to make the most of their new lands. Much of the new territory was indeed as advertised. The fertile valleys of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers were perfect for farming, and the Rocky Mountains were rich in minerals. But there was also a great deal that was unexpected. For example, the Great Plains were not as empty as some had imagined. In fact, they were home to hundreds of thousands of bison and other game animals, as well as to the largest Native American nations east of the Mississippi. One of the most important things to understand about the Louisiana Purchase is that it was not just a purchase of land, it was a purchase of potential. The United States bought the right to explore and develop all of the resources that the region had to offer. This included not just natural resources like farmland, minerals, and wildlife, but also human resources like the labor of enslaved people. After the Louisiana Purchase, the United States controlled the vast majority of the Mississippi River watershed. This gave it control over trade in a huge chunk of North America. The Mississippi River was one of the world's greatest waterways, and it provided a natural highway for trade and travel. In fact, the river was so important that Napoleon had originally hoped to use it to invade the United States. But as it turned out, the river was more of an asset than a liability. The United States could use the river to ship goods to New Orleans and other Gulf Coast ports, or it could use the river to transport people and supplies to the interior of the continent. The Louisiana Purchase also gave the United States a tremendous amount of land for its citizens to settle on. In the early years of the Republic, most Americans lived along the East Coast, but as the country grew, Americans began to move west. The Louisiana Purchase provided them with a place to go. The fertile soils of the Mississippi Valley were ideal for farming, and there was plenty of land for everyone. The United States was also able to use the Louisiana Purchase to expand its empire in North America. The purchase included all of the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. This gave the United States a claim to the Oregon country, which was then inhabited by Native Americans, Spanish, British, and a small number of Americans. The United States would eventually fight a war with Britain over the Oregon country, but that's a story for another time. But what about the people who already lived in the Louisiana Purchase? When the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, it did not consult the Native Americans who lived there. In fact, most Americans didn't even know that there were Native Americans in the region. This would soon change. As Americans began to explore and settle in the Louisiana Purchase, they came into conflict with the Native Americans who lived there. The United States would eventually force most of these tribes west, but this would be a long and bloody process. So what happened to the Native Americans who lived in the Louisiana Purchase? Some were forced to move west, while others were killed or enslaved. In the years following the Louisiana Purchase, the United States would grow dramatically. In fact, it would double in size. This growth would come at a cost. The United States would commit terrible atrocities against Native Americans. But that's a story for another time. In the meantime, let's go ahead and bring this chapter to a close. The United States now controlled more land than it could possibly use. But it wasn't just the amount of land that was surprising. It was also the variety of land. The United States now had everything from coastal plains to mountain ranges. This meant that its citizens could live wherever they wanted. They could farm on the plains, mine in the mountains, or fish on the coast. The Louisiana Purchase was one of the greatest land deals in history. It made the United States the third largest country in the world. It also gave the United States control over the Mississippi River and the valuable port of New Orleans. Finally, it opened up the West to American settlement. All of this would have a profound impact on the future of the United States. It would set the stage for the nation's westward expansion, and it would help to make the United States the continental power it is today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, where you can listen to the stories of the greatest country on earth. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Well, hey there and welcome back to my channel. And we've got another exciting chapter here in our textbook, chapter 12, which covers the Lewis and Clark expedition. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so let's begin with our big question, which is who were Lewis and Clark, and why should I care about their expedition? So first off, the whole story starts when Thomas Jefferson decides that he wants to send an expedition out west to explore what he just bought in the Louisiana Purchase. And so he asks two of his personal friends, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to go out and do the exploring. Now, Lewis and Clark, of course, are up for the job, and they're joined by a few others, and together they form what would come to be known as the Corps of Discovery. Now, the purpose of this expedition was threefold. No. 1. They would map the Louisiana Purchase. It was a huge chunk of land, and Jefferson wanted to know what the heck was out there. No. 2. They were also to explore the Pacific Northwest, specifically the Columbia River watershed, because Jefferson believed that this would be the key to economic success for the United States. He thought that if we had control of this river system, we could easily trade with the Chinese and the rest of the Eastern world, and so that would bring in wealth to the United States and make everyone happy. And third, Lewis and Clark were also charged with establishing good relations with the various tribes they encountered. Jefferson, being the Democrat that he was, believed in peaceful coexistence with Native Americans, and thought that if he could just have Lewis and Clark go out there and make friends with him, then everybody would get along famously. All right, so those are the big goals of the expedition. But let's think like a historian for a minute and ask some more specific questions. Like, okay, why does Jefferson want to explore all of this land? Well, one of the big reasons is that he's super excited about this thing called manifest destiny, which is the belief that the United States is destined by God to expand its dominion across the entire North American continent. And so it's kind of like a divine mission. This isn't just land we're talking about here. This is God's land that we are supposed to have, and therefore, we should explore it, and we should settle it, and we should make it ours. And hey, if there are Native Americans living there, maybe we can befriend them. But if not, then hey, God either forgot about them or just didn't put them there yet. So don't worry about it. And then another reason that Jefferson wants to send this expedition out is that he has heard rumors about a shortcut through or over the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. And so he's like, well, if we could find that, then we would have an even easier time trading with the Chinese and the British and everybody else. Oh, right. And then finally, we should probably ask, how did Lewis and Clark get picked for this important mission? Well, both of these guys were longtime personal friends of Jefferson. They had served together in the French and Indian War. Lewis had also been the governor of an Illinois territory, and Clark had been a major in the Revolutionary War. So these guys were respected. They were competent, and most importantly, they knew how to shoot a gun and fight if they had to. All right, now let's see what we can do to get these cows milked. So Lewis and Clark began forming their corps of discovery in the summer of 1803, and they quickly found out that putting together an expedition to explore an entire continent is really difficult. So they spent much of the next year recruiting men, supplies, weapons, food, all of that stuff. And eventually they set out from St. Louis in the spring of 1804. Okay, so now let us spend a little bit of time walking along the timeline and hit some of the major events of the Lewis and Clark expedition. First of all, we have to talk about Sacagawea. So early on in the expedition, Lewis and Clark meet up with a group of fur traders who tell them that they need to hire a guide to help them navigate the Rocky Mountains. And that guide is a young Native American woman named Sac. She and her husband, Toussaint, join the expedition, and she becomes famous for several reasons. No, an, uno. Sacagawea is pregnant and soon gives birth to a baby boy while the group is camped along the banks of the Columbia River. And so that shows the Native American tribes they encountered that these explorers come in peace. Because if they were hostile, they surely wouldn't be stopping to have babies. No. To Sacagawea, as presence on the expedition helps, Lewis and Clark establish friendly relations with many of the tribes they encounter, because she can serve as a translator and she also knows the land and its resources and where to find food and all of that. Anontre Sacagawea is a symbol of the Native American peoples to the explorers. So wherever they go, they know that they are in Native American lands, and they can only hope that the tribes they meet will be as friendly to them as Sacagawea and her people have been. Next up, let's talk about the Native Americans that Lewis and Clark encountered on their journey. As you might imagine, there were dozens of different tribes between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean, and they were not all friendly. In fact, one of the most significant encounters that Lewis and Clark had was with the Shoshone people after crossing the Rocky Mountains. You may recall that at this point in the journey, they needed a guide to help them through the mountains, and they met up with a band of Shoshone. One of the leaders of this band was a man named Kameawait, and he agreed to be their guide if they would help him get revenge on a rival tribe. So Lewis and Clark agreed and helped the Shoshones defeat their rivals. And in return, the Shoshones gave them horses to ride, which allowed the explorers to travel much faster across the Rocky Mountains. Now, as you can probably already guess, this wasn't the last time that Lewis and Clark got involved in tribal conflicts, and it won't be the last time we talk about this on the channel. But the main takeaway here is that the relationships Lewis and Clark formed with Native Americans varied, depending on who they met and the circumstances of the meeting. In some cases, they were able to befriend them and establish peaceful relations. But in other cases, they chose to align themselves with certain tribes in order to achieve their goals. Okay, and then finally, let us finish up our discussion of the expedition by talking about the significance of reaching the Pacific Ocean. In November of 1805, after a very long and arduous journey, Lewis and Clark and a small group of men reached the Pacific coast, and they immediately began planning for how to get back east. Now, while Lewis and Clark explored the Pacific Northwest, the rest of the corps of discovery spent the winter at a place called Fort Clatsop, which is located in present-day Oregon. And when Lewis and Clark returned to the fort in the spring of 1806, they were greeted by a group of explorers from the British Overland Expedition, led by surveyor and cartographer John Mears. Now, the significance of this meeting is that it marked the first time that representatives of the United States and Great Britain had met since the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the Revolutionary War. The two groups stayed together for several weeks and traded information about their respective countries before parting ways. Lewis and Clark continued onto the Columbia River and eventually back to St. Louis, while Mears and his crew headed back to China. Okay, That's what we've got to cover for this chapter. And hey, real quick before we go, if you want me to keep making these videos, then by all means subscribe. It really helps me out. Okay? I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimer, out.
Chapter 13, Native Nations and the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so for this chapter we're going to talk about how the deal to buy Louisiana from France and Spain kind of just ignored the fact that there were dozens of Native American nations living there. And if you've been watching this series for any amount of time at all, you know that's a bit of a pattern, right? Like whenever powerful white dudes are making deals about land in this period, they tend to ignore the people who actually live there. But here's the thing, it's not just that these European powers didn't care about the rights of native peoples. The relationship between these Europeans and the natives was super complex and often contradictory. And we're gonna get into that in this video. Okay, so let's start with some context. In the late 18th century, most of the land that would become the United States had been purchased, stolen or claimed by one of three European powers, Britain, France or Spain. This map shows those claims pretty well. As you can see, the Spanish controlled most of the South, including what is today Florida and Louisiana. The British controlled everything north of that, and the French still held on to this big chunk up here in Canada, and this smaller chunk down here in the Gulf of Mexico. This Louisiana territory was a remnant of the vast colonial empire that France had built up in North America during the 1600s. But by the 1700s, they had lost almost all of that land, except for a few areas around the Great Lakes, and this slice down here in the south. The vast majority of the Louisiana colony was actually in the modern-day American Midwest, which makes sense since it was originally called Louisiana in honor of the French King Louis XIV. But despite its size, the colony only had a few thousand French settlers, and a lot of them lived in this small area around New Orleans. The rest of the land was mostly inhabited by Native Americans. Now, when we say Native Americans, we're talking about hundreds of different nations and cultures of people. But in this video, we're mostly talking about the ones in the Ohio River Valley and around the Great Lakes, like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Now, if you want to learn more about the many other native nations that lived in the Louisiana Purchase, I recommend checking out this video from my friends over at the Native American and Indigenous Studies program at a university. They cover a lot of the same topics that we're gonna now be hitting on in this video, but they go way deeper and they have a lot more time to tell their story. So the history of these native nations in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes goes back thousands of years, and they have really deep cultural and historic ties to the land. Many of them were agricultural societies who grew crops like corn and tobacco and squash, and they also hunted and fished in the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes. But by the mid-1700s, things were getting tough for a lot of these tribes, because they were under pressure from both the British and the Spanish. See, both the British and the Spanish had been encroaching on tribal lands by building forts and trading posts, and pushing the natives away from their ancestral lands. To make matters worse, diseases brought over by Europeans had devastated native populations, and that made it harder for them to resist the encroachment of the Europeans. Many of the tribes in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes had been pushed farther west by the British and the Spanish, and they hoped to find refuge in the Louisiana Territory, which was relatively empty at the time. But once the US bought Louisiana, things didn't really get better for these native nations. The Louisiana Purchase was a disaster for basically everyone who lived there, especially the Native Americans. And that's because while the purchase did include the lands where many of these tribes lived, the United States didn't actually have a great understanding of exactly where those boundaries were. You see, the US government didn't really think of Native American tribes as having clear legal boundaries or borders. Instead, they thought of tribal land as something that was open to hunting and gathering, which anyone could do. So they didn't think it was possible for a tribe to own land in the same way that individuals could. The best example of this is the case of the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. Both of these tribes lived in the Mississippi Valley, but the United States government could untell the difference between their land because they didn't have clearly defined borders. So they just sort of lumped them together and called it Indian Territory. Then they went ahead and put two white guys in charge of this territory, William C. Claiborne and George I.M. Perry, and they told them to administer the area according to the laws and customs of the United States. That meant that the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and all of the other tribes that lived in Indian Territory were suddenly subject to US law. without having any representation in the US government. It also meant that the federal government now had authority to make treaties with these tribes and force them to give up their land in exchange for some other piece of land that was not nearly as good. And that's exactly what happened. In 1805, the United States government forced the Choctaw to give up most of their land in exchange for an area west of the Mississippi River. And then, in 1816, they did the same thing to the Chickasaw. By the end of the 1820s, most of the major tribes that had lived in the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes had been pushed west of the Mississippi. Some of them, like the Cherokee, tried to assimilate to American culture in order to keep some of their land. Others, like the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, fought back against the Americans. But ultimately, none of them were able to stay in the lands they had lived in for thousands of years. But there was one group of people who managed to hold on to their land in the face of all this pressure. Okay, so earlier in this video we talked about how the US bought the Louisiana Territory from France and Spain. But really, it was a lot more complicated than that. First off, the United States didn't pay France and Spain for the land. Instead, they paid them for the right to buy the land. See, the original deal to buy Louisiana was made in 1803 between President Thomas Jefferson and Napoleon Bonaparte, who at the time was running France. Napoleon had originally planned to use the money he got from selling Louisiana to finance a war against the British in the Caribbean. But the war hadn't gone well, and Napoleon desperately needed money. So he cut a deal with the US that gave them the option to buy Louisiana for $15 million. The US agreed to this deal, but they didn't actually pay Napoleon until 1805, and by then, Napoleon had lost the war and he was in desperate need of cash. So he agreed to sell Louisiana to the US for less than he had originally asked for, $15 million instead of the $20 million he had wanted. Spain ended up getting $5 million for their part of the deal, which was mostly just Florida. But they didn't actually get that money until 1821, nearly 20 years after the purchase. Meanwhile, the tribes that lived in Louisiana didn't get anything. They were just sort of expected to disappear. And that's not surprising given that neither France nor Spain nor the United States ever really saw the tribes as legitimate owners of the land. Instead, they viewed the tribes as obstacles to progress. In many ways, the tribes were seen as backward and uncivilized, and the white Americans believed that they were superior to the natives and had the right to take their land from them. This attitude was summed up perfectly by President Thomas Jefferson in a letter he wrote to the American minister to France in 1784. In the letter, Jefferson explained why he was so excited about the prospect of buying Louisiana. He said that the territory was full of savage tribes who were a disgrace to the human race, and he said that it was his dream to see these savages removed from the country and replaced by civilized people. Basically, Jefferson and the other white Americans saw the Louisiana Purchase as an opportunity to bring civilization to the wilderness and to replace the uncivilized natives with civilized Americans. And that's exactly what they did. Within a few decades of the purchase, most of the tribes that had lived in the Louisiana Territory had been pushed off of their land and forced to move west. And that had a devastating impact on these tribes. Their way of life was completely upended, and they were forced to leave behind the homes and the land that their ancestors had lived on for thousands of years. The tribes also lost access to the resources that they had relied on for their survival, such as the bison, which were killed off by the thousands, and they were exposed to new diseases that devastated their populations. For example, in 1838, the US government forced the Cherokee on a brutal march from their ancestral lands to a reservation in Oklahoma. This event, which became known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of thousands of Cherokee. Ultimately, the Louisiana Purchase was a disaster for the Native Americans. Their populations were decimated by disease and war, and they were forced to give up their ancestral lands and move west. But it was also a disaster for the environment. The massive amounts of land that were opened up by the purchase led to overhunting and the extinction of many species of animals. And the introduction of European agriculture and farming methods led to the destruction of many ecosystems. Still, despite all of this, the Louisiana Purchase is often seen as a great American triumph. It's taught to us as this incredible deal that doubled the size of the young United States and set us on the path to becoming a global power. But the reality was much more complex. The purchase was a disaster for the Native Americans and the environment, and it set the stage for centuries of conflict over land and resources. Okay, So remember when I said that the relationship between the Europeans and the natives was complex and often contradictory? Well, this is a good example of that. On the one hand, the US government was willing to commit terrible atrocities against Native Americans in order to take their land. But on the other hand, they also made efforts to coexist with the natives and even learn their culture. For example, in 1804, President Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on an expedition to explore the Louisiana Territory and learn about the Native American tribes that lived there. Lewis and Clark spent 2 years traveling through the territory, and they collected information about the geography, the wildlife, and the Native Americans. Their journey was documented in detail by an enslaved man named York, who was an indispensable member of the team. He kept a journal of the trip and helped the explorers navigate the wilderness. Despite being enslaved, York was able to play a critical role in the success of the mission and help expand American knowledge of the West. Unfortunately, his contributions were largely forgotten until relatively recently. Anyway, after returning to St. Louis in 1806, Lewis and Clark published their findings and helped promote a positive image of the Louisiana Purchase. They described the territory as beautiful and abundant, and the Native Americans as noble and friendly. Now, this wasn't always accurate. There were plenty of times when Lewis and Clark encountered hostility from Native Americans, but they generally downplayed those instances in their reports. Still, their reports were widely circulated, and they helped to promote a sense of optimism about the future of the United States. Okay, so that's what happened to the Native Americans after the Louisiana Purchase. They were forced to move west, and they suffered greatly along the way. But it's important to remember that they weren't just passive victims of American expansion. They fought back against the Americans, but ultimately they weren't able to stop the tide of American expansionism. The Louisiana Purchase had a devastating impact on Native Americans and their way of life. It set the stage for centuries of conflict over land and resources, and it led to the deaths of thousands of Native Americans. But it's also important to remember that Native Americans aren't a monolith. There were dozens of different tribes living in the Louisiana Purchase, and each one had its own unique culture and way of life. And finally, it's also important to remember that Native Americans continued to be a vital part of American society today. Despite the challenges they have faced, they have preserved their cultures and traditions, and they continue to fight for justice and equality.
Okay, Mr. Williams here with a quick review of Chapter 14. Long-term impact on the US. If you're ready to get those brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, first things first. What did Spain do for the US in Chapter 14? Well, they basically doubled the size of the nation overnight. That's right. When the United States declared war on Spain in 1898, it controlled only the land between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But after winning the Spanish-American War, the United States would control all of these lands here, as well as this land here. That's a big deal, because the United States went from being this relatively small nation to one that spanned across an entire continent. Now, if you're wondering where all this land came from, we need to talk about two key places. First up is Mississippi, which was a vital waterway for trade between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. And while neither Spain nor the US controlled any of this land in Central America, they both knew that whoever controlled this area controlled the Mississippi River, and therefore had a tremendous amount of power over trade in the region. In other words, if Spain still controlled this area, it could use the Mississippi River to block trade between the US East Coast and West Coast. So that wasn't acceptable for the United States. So by acquiring these lands in Chapter 13, the US effectively strengthened its own independence by taking away Spain's ability to hinder its trade. Now second, the acquisition of the Philippines also allowed the United States to have more control over the Pacific, and therefore made it easier for them to expand their influence throughout Asia. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, why would the US want to acquire the Philippines or any of this other land? And that's a great question, and it takes us to our second topic, manifest destiny. Now, the concept of manifest destiny was the idea that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy across the entire North American continent. And while the idea started way back in 1800, it was during the Spanish-American War that the United States began to truly embrace it. I mean, prior to the war, most Americans were happy to simply control the lands between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But after the war, when Americans realized that they could get more land, many began to argue for territorial expansion. In fact, many Americans began to believe that it was not only inevitable, but also necessary that the US expand into Hawaii. Alaska, and even Central America. And so the United States began to do just that. But before we talk about how the United States tried to fulfill its destiny in Chapter 15, let us finish up our discussion of Chapter 14 by talking about why these territorial acquisitions were such a big deal. And when we say that they were a big deal, we mean that they were a big deal for 3 reasons. First, these territories provided raw materials that could be used by American factories. For example, the Philippines was full of rich minerals and agricultural products that could help fuel industrialization back home. Same thing with Hawaii. Its sugar plantations provided the raw materials for making sugar, which was very important to the growth of the U.S. economy. Second, the new territories helped open up new markets for American goods. For example, American manufacturers could now sell their products in the Philippines, and American farmers could sell their produce in Hawaii. This expansion into foreign markets helped boost the American economy at a time when many people were calling for more industrialization. And third, the new territories provided the United States with naval bases throughout the world. Remember, the United States had recently become a world power, and like all world powers, it needed naval bases to project its power around the world. Places like Guam and the Philippines gave the U.S. Navy places to dock and refuel and repair. And that was important because it allowed the U.S. Navy to stay out to sea longer, which meant that it could protect American interests around the globe more effectively. So there you go. The main idea of Chapter 14 is that the United States acquired a lot of land. Like a lot. Not only did it double the size of the country, but it also opened up new opportunities for trade and industry, and it allowed the U.S. Navy to travel the world more easily. Okay, let's go ahead and knock out these easy mode questions really quickly. First up, what event caused the United States to become a world power? And of course, that would be the Spanish-American War. Second, what were 3 arguments used to justify American imperialism? And this is right here on page 469. And of course, the first one is that they were superior to other cultures. And then, secondly, they were fulfilling manifest destiny. And third, they would bring Christianity to the natives. Okay, easy peasy. Third, what was the significance of the Philippines in terms of American foreign policy? Well, the significance of the Philippines is that it allowed the United States to have more control over the Pacific, and therefore made it easier for them to expand their influence throughout Asia. Fourth, who were the 2 candidates running in the 1896 election, and what were their views on imperialism? Well, the 2 candidates were William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. And William McKinley was in favor of imperialism, and William Jennings Bryan was not. And finally, what was the name of the group that protested the war with Spain? And that would be the Anti-Imperialist League. Okay, now we're gonna shift gears and move into the hard mode questions. And for your convenience, I have provided the page numbers for each of these questions in the document I uploaded to my website. And if you have my world history curriculum, then you already have access to that document. But if you don't have my curriculum and you want access to this document, well, you're not gonna want to miss out on this offer. Alright, first up, how did the Spanish-American War change the relationship between the United States and Latin America? This question can be answered with the help of 2 concepts, the first of which is dollar diplomacy. And this was a foreign policy tool that was used by the United States to exert influence in Latin America. Basically, the US would invest heavily in Latin American economies through the buying of businesses and the construction of infrastructure. By investing so much money in Latin America, the US gained a significant amount of political clout and influence. Like if the US invested millions of dollars into a country, it could use that investment as leverage to influence that country's government. The second concept you need to know is the Monroe Doctrine. And if you don't remember what that is, gosh, it's been so long since we've talked about it. Let me just give you a quick refresher. Essentially, the Monroe Doctrine was a policy that was designed to prevent European powers from interfering in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. It was established in 1823 and had been largely ignored by Europe until the Spanish-American War. But after the war, the United States had become a world power and could now back up the Monroe Doctrine with military force. So anytime a European power threatened to interfere in the affairs of a Western Hemisphere nation, the US would intervene. For example, in 1904, the United States sent troops to the Dominican Republic to protect American business interests, and in 1914, it would intervene in Haiti and set up a military government. So basically, the Spanish-American War led to the creation of a new Monroe Doctrine. The US was now committed to using military force to protect the Western Hemisphere. Okay, next up, Why did the United States decide to annex Hawaii, and how did it do it? Well, the United States decided to annex Hawaii mainly for economic reasons. First off, Hawaii was a perfect spot for a naval base, and that's exactly what the US did. They built a naval base there that would eventually become Pearl Harbor. Secondly, Hawaii provided a market for American goods. For example, American manufacturers could sell their products to the Hawaiians, and American farmers could sell their produce. And third, Hawaii provided valuable resources like sugar that could be used in American factories. Now, the US annexed Hawaii by first overthrowing its queen, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but it's true. In 1893, a group of American businessmen overthrew Queen Liliuokalani, and then asked the United States to annex the islands. President Grover Cleveland didn't want to annex Hawaii, but President William McKinley did. Okay, next, how did the United States acquire the Philippines? And again, this question can be answered with the help of two concepts. The first of which is the Teller Amendment, and the purpose of this amendment was to reassure the world that the United States only wanted to liberate Cuba and not take any territory from Spain. In other words, they wouldn't annex Cuba. However, the Teller Amendment said nothing about the Philippines, leaving the door open for American annexation. The second concept you need to know is the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment outlined the conditions under which the United States would return Cuba to independence. And those conditions included the following. Number 1, Cuba couldn't make any treaties that would compromise its independence. Number 2, the United States would have the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. No. 3, the United States could purchase Guantanamo Bay for a naval station. And fourth, the United States would always have a special relationship with Cuba. So basically, the Platt Amendment gave the United States a lot of control over Cuba and made it extremely difficult for Cuba to ever be truly independent. Next, how did American perspectives on imperialism change after the Spanish-American War? Well, before the Spanish-American War, most Americans opposed imperialism because they believed it went against the principles of democracy and individual liberty. And that's certainly true of Thomas Jefferson, who once said, quote, "We can't extend our empire over others without, in some degree, ceasing to be ourselves." However, after the war, Americans began to argue that imperialism was actually in line with the principles of democracy and individual liberty. For example, many Americans began to argue that it was the duty of the United States to bring democracy to other countries. This argument was used by both Republicans and Democrats, but it was especially popular among Republicans. As a result, the Republican Party became known as the Party of Imperialism. And then finally, what was the significance of the Philippine-American War? Well, the significance of the Philippine-American War is that it showed the world that the United States was a true imperial power. The war was extremely brutal and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. And while the US was fighting against an Asian power, it was also fighting against an Asian ideology. The Filipinos were nationalists who wanted to be free from all foreign rule, and the US was trying to prevent them from achieving that goal. So the Philippine-American War was a clash between two imperial powers, and it showed the world that the US was willing to use tremendous force to achieve its imperial goals. Okay, I hope that helped. If you want even more help, then click right here and grab my view packet. It'll help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I'm Mr. Williams, and I'm out. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in American history. As we arrive at our final chapter, we're going to reflect on the Louisiana Purchase, a bargain that didn't just double the size of a young nation, but fundamentally shaped its destiny. So, buckle up as we conclude this incredible story. When we look back, the most striking thing about the Louisiana Purchase is just how utterly unexpected it was. Imagine this. President Thomas Jefferson sends his envoys, James Monroe and Robert Livingston, to Paris with a simple, relatively modest goal. They had a budget of $10 million, and their mission was to secure the port of New Orleans and, if possible, parts of Florida. This was all about ensuring American farmers and traders could freely use the Mississippi River, a vital artery for the nation's economy. No one, not even Jefferson, in his most ambitious dreams, imagined they'd be offered the entire Louisiana territory. Think about the sheer shock Monroe and Livingston must have felt. They were there to negotiate for a city and a coastline. And suddenly, Napoleon's minister, Francois Barbe Marbois, offers them a landmass stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. That's 828,000 square miles. It was an offer that came out of the blue, a geopolitical curveball of epic proportions. The French, facing renewed conflict with Britain and reeling from the disastrous Haitian Revolution, saw their North American ambitions crumbling. For Napoleon, Louisiana was no longer a strategic asset, but a liability he needed to liquidate, and fast. The negotiators on the American side were in a bind. This wasn't in their instructions. Communication with Washington took months, a frustratingly long time in an age of sailing ships. There was no way to get Jefferson's quick approval. They had to make a decision, right then and there. A decision that would far exceed their mandate and their budget. They took a gamble, a calculated risk, agreeing to a price of $15 million, a figure that, while over budget, amounted to a jaw-droppingly low price of about 3 cents an acre. It was a moment of bold, decisive action that would have monumental consequences. Back in America, the news was met with a mixture of celebration and controversy. Jefferson, a staunch advocate for limited government and a strict interpretation of the Constitution, found himself in a peculiar philosophical dilemma. The Constitution didn't explicitly grant the president the power to acquire new territory. He had built his political career on opposing the Federalists' broad interpretation of federal power. And now he was contemplating the single largest executive action in the nation's history. He even considered a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase. But his advisors warned him that the deal could fall through if they waited. The window of opportunity with Napoleon was closing. Ultimately, Jefferson had to be a pacifist. He reconciled his constitutional scruples with the undeniable, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity before him. He argued that his treaty-making power as president gave him the authority, a stretch of constitutional interpretation that his opponents were quick to point out. But the lure of the West was too strong to ignore. He saw this vast expanse of land as the key to realizing his vision of an empire of liberty. What was this empire of liberty? For Jefferson, it wasn't about colonial domination in the European sense. It was about creating a republic of independent, self-sufficient yeoman farmers. He believed that for a republic to thrive, its citizens needed to own land. Land ownership fostered virtue, independence, and a stake in the success of the nation. Without it, he feared America would descend into the crowded, corrupt, and class-divided societies of Europe. The Louisiana Purchase was the physical canvas on which this grand vision could be painted. It provided, in his mind, enough land for 1,000 generations of Americans to live out this agrarian ideal. This wasn't just a philosophical dream. It was a strategic imperative. Securing the western bank of the Mississippi and removing a powerful European presence from the nation's backyard was a massive geopolitical win. It solidified American control over the continent and set the stage for westward expansion. The Lewis and Clark expedition, which Jefferson commissioned even before the purchase was finalized, was the first step in understanding and claiming this new domain. They were tasked with exploring this unknown land, finding a water route to the Pacific, establishing trade with Native American tribes, and documenting the region's geography, plants, and animals. Their journey was an epic of discovery, opening the eyes of the nation to the sheer scale and potential of its new territory. Of course, this narrative of an empire of liberty is complex and, from a modern perspective, deeply problematic. The land wasn't empty. It was home to hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, with diverse cultures and established societies that had existed for millennia. The purchase, made between two foreign powers, completely disregarded their claims and sovereignty. The expansion that followed led to a century of conflict, broken treaties, and the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. The expansion of this empire of liberty for some came at the direct expense of the liberty and lives of others. Furthermore, the purchase tragically expanded the reach of slavery. While the new territories sparked fierce debates over whether they would be admitted to the Union as free or slave states, debates that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. The immediate effect was the creation of new plantations and a massive new market for enslaved people. The dream of an agrarian republic became, in many parts of the new territory, a nightmare of forced labor. The Louisiana Purchase, therefore, carries a dual legacy, one of opportunity and growth, and another of displacement and bondage. It is a stark reminder that the shaping of a nation is often a messy, contradictory, and painful process. Despite these critical complexities, it is impossible to overstate the impact of the Louisiana Purchase. It is, without question, one of the greatest land deals in history. For a paltry sum, the United States acquired a territory rich in resources that would fuel its economic growth for the next century. It provided the space for waves of immigration and settlement, defining the American character as one of pioneering spirit and relentless forward motion. It transformed a fledgling coastal republic into a continental power, setting its trajectory to become a global force. From the wheat fields of the Great Plains to the rich mineral deposits of the Rocky Mountains, the Louisiana Territory became the heartland of America. The purchase fundamentally altered the nation's psychological and political landscape. It embedded the idea of manifest destiny, the belief in America as divinely ordained right to expand across the continent deep into the national consciousness. Every major event in 19th-century American history, from westward migration and the gold rush to the Indian Wars and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, is linked back to this single, momentous transaction. So, as we close this series, we're left with a powerful conclusion. The Louisiana Purchase was a product of chance, of European politics, of diplomatic audacity, and of a president who was willing to bend his own principles for what he saw as the nation's greater good. It was a bargain that shaped a nation, defining its borders, its economy, its identity, and its future. It was a moment that propelled the United States onto a new and extraordinary path, for better and for worse. The echoes of that $15 million deal, struck in Paris over 2 centuries ago, still resonate today in the very fabric of America. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the story of the Louisiana Purchase. It's a testament to how unexpected moments can change the course of history. If you've enjoyed this series, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below with your thoughts or suggestions for our next topic. Until next time, stay curious.